What are you greedy for? Go on, be honest. Do you collect clothes, books, jewellery, nice household things? Do you secretly yearn for more money, power or status? We all experience greed in one way or another. It's just not a thing we tend to fess up to. But is our secret avarice actually making our lives worse? And if so, what can we do to turn it around? My name's Hazel Gale. I'm a former therapist turned author and creator of the Betwixt app. And I'm delving into the fascinating wisdom to be taken from myth, fairy tales and other forms of story, especially when viewed through the lens of Jungian psychology. In this series, we're breaking down, reframing, understanding and occasionally debunking the 7 deadly sins. Today, greed, which is not to be confused with gluttony, by the way, the food-related version of greed. This greed is the kind that makes us hungry for wealth or status or power or anything like that. Surely the most famous story to warn, ostensibly at least, of the sinful dangers of greed is the myth of King Midas. Here's how it goes in brief. Midas was the ruler of a modest kingdom. Like any other king, he was wealthy and lived in comparative luxury, but he wasn't the richest of kings. What he did have, though, was a beautiful rose garden, and he'd spend his happiest moments wandering among the blooms, smelling their sweet scent and enjoying time with his beloved daughter Marigold. Midas's weakness, however, was real gold. Obsessed by the accumulation of wealth, this king believed that gold was at the root of his happiness, and therefore wanted more. One day, the god Dionysus passed through Midas's kingdom, and one of his entourage, Silenus, who was also a rustic god of the forest, drunkenness and winemaking, got lost along the way, and he wound up napping off his hangover in the king's famous rose gardens. When Midas and Marigold found Silenus passed out under a bush, rather than casting his smelly self out, the king offered the old man generous hospitality. He fed and watered him and enjoyed his company for a few days before delivering him back to Dionysus, who was so impressed by this generosity that he offered King Midas a wish. Without hesitation, Midas asked for the power to turn everything he touched into gold. Upon hearing this wish, Dionysus raised a godly eyebrow and said, "Are you sure about that?" Midas, however, was insistent. The golden touch was what he wanted. And so Dionysus huffed out a little knowing sigh and told the king to go home and wash his hands with wine. After that, he said, Midas's wish would come true. And it did. And Midas rejoiced. He ran around the palace, alchemizing everything he could see, chairs and tables and all manner of other things, watching them transform into pure, shiny golden gold. Then he ventured out into his beloved garden, high on the thrill of success, and lifted a rose to his nose. But of course, the moment he touched it, the rose became metal. I'll just have to enjoy the fragrance without touching the roses, he thought, a little disappointed. Next, though, he tried to eat a grape, which also turned to gold, as did a slice of bread and the water he attempted to drink. And now, fear was upon him. Desperate tears began to fill the king's eyes, and in that moment Marigold entered the room. Instinctively, Midas pulled her into an embrace, hoping for comfort. But of course, she only transformed into a cold and motionless golden statue. In horror, Midas realized his mistake. He raised his arms to beg Dionysus to reverse the spell. Thankfully, the god took pity on the foolish king. "Go down to the river of Pactolus," he said. "Cleanse your hands with its water, and your curse will be lifted." Midas did so without delay, and watched in astonishment as the gold of his touch washed away. He then returned home a changed man, to find Marigold and everything else that he'd transformed restored to its rightful state. From then on, Midas vowed to share his great fortune with the people of his kingdom, who all thus led prosperous lives. And when one day he died, they all mourned after their beloved king. As with all of the myths and fairy tales we're exploring in this little series, the tale of King Midas clearly warns of the dangers of greed. We're invited to think about our unchecked desires and to consider the consequences of overreaching and becoming slaves to our own hunger. But of course, avarice, as with all the 7 deadly sins, is not fundamentally bad. Indeed, greed has genuine benefits. As a social species that exists in a hierarchy, we have evolved the desire to accumulate resources because these determine our position in that hierarchy. They win us rewards such as attention and care from others, alliances, and the opportunity to start a family if we want such a thing. So greed is adaptive and, in one way or another, unavoidable. But there is a big difference between someone who acknowledges and accepts greed as part of being human and therefore factors it into their decision-making, and someone who allows themselves to be driven and consumed by this force. To underscore the importance of this, let's take a look at how greed affects our behaviour. Professor Paul Piff from the University of California, who has devoted much of his career to researching greed, has some very intriguing data to share. One of his studies set pairs of people up to play a game of rigged Monopoly. The game began with a coin toss. the winner of which received extra money before the start of play, were allowed to roll 2 dice as opposed to just 1, and they made double the income whenever they passed go. Oh, and they also got to use the luxury car playing piece as opposed to the old boot. Nice touch. The idea was to test the effects of putting someone into a temporary position of financial advantage. What they found was that at the beginning of the game, the lucky rich player would often seem a little awkward and apologetic. As the game went on, though, and they got wealthier and more successful, they started to gloat. They became louder, ate more of the food on offer, and generally revelled in their success. Apparently, they literally took up more space at the table. And the bigger they got, the less attuned they became to the plight of the poor player. To really cap this off, after the game, when filling out a questionnaire that asked the rich players how they had won, they took credit. They talked about how their superior decision-making led to their triumph, not the flip of a coin that clearly dictated the result. Frightening. In another study, people of varying levels of real-life wealth were paired up, one of them being given a tenner and the other nothing. The one with the money had to decide whether or not they were going to share their £10, and if they were to do so, how to make the split. What they found here, which is equally terrifying, was that the more wealthy the participant was in real life, the less they were likely to share of this gifted money. The conclusion drawn by Piff and his team was that greed has a lot to do with circumstance. The more we have, wealth, status, power, whatever, the more entitled and greedy we become. Even when an advantage we enjoy is not something we've had to earn, we usually feel deserving of the success we experience as a result. Moreover, and worst yet, this line of research indicates that when someone has more money than someone else, they will operate in a way that suggests that they feel superior, fundamentally better than those who have less. So why is this the case? Piff proposes one possible answer. Money buys you space. If you are rich, you'll probably have a big house, your management role is likely to grant you your own office and fewer equal level peers to work with. You take cabs rather than the tube, you fly business class. Also, the more financially independent you are, the less you need other people. And when you don't need others and you don't have others around, Piff claims, your empathy can diminish. And indeed, studies have shown social class and neural empathetic responses to be inversely correlated. So does greed come hand in hand with this connection? Are greed and loneliness linked? This brings us back to King Midas. Like the coin toss winning Monopoly players, Midas's presumably inherited wealth gave him a sense of entitlement and an insatiable desire for more. When he started to get more, though, rather than delivering happiness, the golden touch rendered the king unable to fulfill his most basic needs. Food and water were inaccessible, his beloved daughter paralysed, and he could no longer enjoy the sweet scent of that beautiful rose garden. He was literally unable to stop and smell the roses. Once wealthy beyond measure, Midas found himself lost and alone. The richer he grew in a material sense, the more profound his disconnection and spiritual poverty. A quick note here that the popular belief that money can't buy happiness is not as black and white as it might seem. The data is actually mixed, but most people agree on one thing at least. If someone doesn't have adequate income to comfortably satisfy their basic needs, more money absolutely does increase happiness. What it doesn't seem to touch, however, is a heartfelt sense of authentic self-worth and purpose. Because that's an inside job. That is a different job. Self-worth can't be bought, added, or accumulated. It's already right there. Our job is not to acquire it, but to reconnect with it as something that has existed from the very beginning. The message of Midas's story is no less relevant today than it ever was. But rather than depicting the dangers of greed as a fundamental sin, I'd say it's more helpful to understand this story as a reminder to handle the archetypal energy of greed with care. It's okay to want more. What's important is whether we align our desires with our real or ideal self. In psychology, the terms real self and ideal self are used to describe different versions of self-concept. Your real self is who you actually are. The part of you that wants to live, love, connect, be present, laugh, cry, and enthuse about the things that truly matter to you. The real self isn't concerned with keeping up appearances or fitting in, it just is. And here's the important thing. Only when we live in line with our real, authentic selves can we experience true, pure, authentic happiness. The ideal self, on the other hand, is a product of the superego or social conditioning. It's who we think we should be and how we want other people to see us. Having more money means we get to feel like we're winning the ideal self game. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you choose to look at it, success in that game does not convert to a deep felt sense of fulfillment, because the harder we buy into the ideal self, the further we move away from the real self. For King Midas, the ideal self looked like the archetypal king, drenched in glittering gold. His real self was the version of him that loved to walk through his beautiful rose garden, which serves as a symbol for the experience of being present with his daughter. The Jungian interpretation of this myth sees Marigold, his daughter, as the anima, that is, as King Midas's soul, and therefore the only gold that can actually make him happy. The king's moment of truth then comes when the golden touch effectively kills his own soul, turning Marigold into a pretty but inaccessible echo of her former self. Midas's real self was also the generous, caring king who gave hospitality to stinky old Silenus. This means that it was his real self that impressed Dionysus enough to reward him with a wish. Here, the god Dionysus can be seen as a representation of the capital S self, and the awesome power and potential within all of us to make things happen. Dionysus' warning when he first heard the king's foolish request can be understood as the voice of Midas's deeper, wiser self. He wasn't ready at first to hear it. He had to fall before he learned to listen to that authentic knowing. And we probably have to do that too. If you've been listening to this and thinking, oh man, I definitely hold the belief that more whatever will make me happy, then don't worry, because we all fall for the spell of greed and the promise it makes. And it's entirely possible that we have to. The fall is a standard part of the hero's journey after all. It's an archetypal stage on the path to self-actualization. So the question is not whether we fall, how we fall, or what we fall for. It's what we do with the information our fall delivers. In the context of greed, the thing to consider is this. What do you really, authentically want to be greedy for? Rather than the disconnecting promise of gold, power, or respect, what if we chose to be greedy for authentic connection? What if we chose to be greedy for joy in the little things, the thrill of intrinsic motivation, for passion, for the fire of authentic pursuits? What if we chose to be greedy for purpose, fairness, mutual respect, the joy of others, or real love? Perhaps even more importantly, what if we factored into our decisions the knowledge that when in any position of advantage, we are unconsciously predisposed to stinginess? If we were really to own this, surely we would adjust our behaviour accordingly and give a little more. That we're wired for greed doesn't mean we have to chase what the world expects us to be greedy for. There is an abundance of riches out there for all of us, but only if we decide to feed our souls as opposed to our egos. As always, I really hope you found this inspiring and helpful. If so, please like and share this video so others can find it. And if you're the kind of person who loves both stories and personal growth, then be sure to check out our app Betwixt, the mental health game, available on the iOS App Store and Google Play.